Well,
There we go.
there we go.
There we go.
All right. So, just a bit of a background here and why we're here, why we're talking about this. Um, I have been in this industry for the last 11 years now, and I worked for Disney Interactive Studios, the now defunct Club Penguin, for 6 years. And this is where I really got my experience when it comes to content moderation, chat filtering, and really understanding how a community operates online, and learned a lot about gaming there as well. Afterwards, I joined Two Hat, so I have been here for 5 years, and like I said, I'm a director of community trust and safety for the company. I also have co-founded the Fair Play Alliance in the games industry with industry friends, and spoke at a bunch of conferences in the last 3 years. And like I said before, I'm very excited to be here. And just a fun fact, I also play drums in a heavy metal band. Let's hear from Lisa now.
So, hi, I'm Lisa Wood. Unlike Carlos, who's got this wonderful international background, I'm merely a Canadian. I started my career helping build the internet. I worked as an engineer and then a program manager uh, building equipment for Cisco systems. And the little tiny box that you see on the screen is actually in the Guinness Book of World Records. Uh, from there, I then changed industries. I went into video games and I help people play on the internet. I spent 13 years in various roles in video game production, leading tech and content teams, which then concluded as executive producer of Club Penguin Island. So there's this penguin connection here in the office. Now I'm helping keep people safe on the internet. As Carlos mentioned, I'm Director of Research and Data Science at Two Hat. In my free time, I am not a drummer in a heavy metal band. Instead, I enjoy long distance cycling in my spare time. And especially here in British Columbia, that's quite challenging with the hills.
So we're both using paddles
We're
in our
both
free
using
time.
pedals in our free time. Yeah.
Awesome. In terms of an agenda for today, it would be awesome to have Lisa first talk about how user-generated content affects your game, the awesome games that you're developing. And from there, we're going to go a little bit on vision and also talk about the goals for the presentation when we actually get into defining offensive chat, identifying and actioning. We're going to give you takeaways. There will be time for Q&A, so we would love to hear from you at the end. And we know it's a Friday, right? It's depending on where you are, it's late afternoon or maybe already your night. So we're gonna keep it really nice and casual. And there are a bunch of resources at the end of this presentation. So there will be contact information at the end. Feel free to shoot us a message, and we'll make the PDF version of the presentation for you available to you, because it has a lot of hyperlinks, white papers, videos, and all sorts of awesome resources for you.
All right, so how does user-generated content affect your game? Well, first, in today's age of YouTube, Twitch, and various other online platforms, players are discovering your games online. And they are seeing, what usernames your players create, what sort of chat they're having, how people play with each other and interact with each other. And players are forming their opinion of your game long before they even play the game. And based on what they see, they're going to decide whether or not to buy or download your game. One famous example I love to talk about is Fortnite. So almost everybody's heard of Fortnite today. And this chart comes from Google Trends, and it shows the trend in Google searches over the lifespan of Fortnite today. And I've labeled three kind of notable events. So one is, you can see when the Battle Royale launched, and you can see, yeah, there's a spike in interest as people are becoming aware of it. And then this curve of growth as more and more influencers and more people are discovering Fortnite, generally through online platforms. Celebrities were starting to use the dance emotes, and word of the game started getting out. But there's one really notable event in, I believe it was March of 2018, and that's when Ninja, a YouTuber for Fortnite, played with Drake on Twitch. And you can see there the interest and the number of Google searches for Fortnite like doubled overnight. So just the interest just spiked right up. And you can see how long it sustained itself after that event in terms of how much people were discovering and Googling the game. And then the next peak was just this past fall when Fortnite took their games out, the game offline, and in a very dramatic fashion, the entire world was absorbed by a black hole, and they left a black hole on the screen. And everyone was talking about it. Even people who weren't very familiar with Fortnite or even with the video game popularity in general heard about Fortnite because of the black hole event. So you can really see how word gets spread online, and that means players or future players are forming opinion of your game long before they even play it. Next, when you have social features in your game, like chat, it increases engagement and spending. And in one study that Two Hat has done with a prominent video game publisher, actually did a study in saying, all right, how much does this actually affect your game in terms of revenue, in terms of engagement? And you can see from this chart here, this is clearly a free-to-play game. There was a $664 increase in lifetime spending between even just general, like group chat and general public chat. So just even how people are chatting with each other and socializing with each other has an effect on lifetime spending. And then you can see on the other charts, like if there's no chat, session length versus when you have group chat or public chat, and lifetime spending as well. You can see the difference in engagement. So same thing, here you've got, it affects your game. What sort of impression do you want to have on your game? Do you want to have it welcoming and encouraging people to stick around? And then you've got this growth. If it's not, well, then you can have the flip side, which is what the next slide is going to demonstrate. So back in 2015, Game Analytics did a study on game data across over 400 different free-to-play games, and they published this article on 16 reasons why players are leaving your game. And coming in at number 12 was a toxic community. So this is the negative side of the social aspects of games and how people are discovering games. If the impression is negative, or if their experience is negative while they're in the game, they are likely to leave. And so this is where we come in terms of this discussion about trust and safety on online games. If it's positive and welcoming and people want to stick around, you've got growth. And if it's not, then you've got the consequences that people may end up leaving the game.
In terms of other research as well that showed this exact point was last year. EA Games released some research as well, and they talked to the players directly, and players pointed that was one of the reasons why they would perhaps not join a game or think twice, right?
Yeah, it's based off their opinion. Any consumer, we now have the ability to research anything and see what the reviews are anything, and we form an opinion of whether or not we're going to buy long before we do.
Absolutely. So just in terms of framing the conversation of what we do here at Two Hat, essentially we classify, filter, and escalate a lot of human interactions. And when I say human interactions, through user-generated content, right? It could be text, comments, usernames, images, and videos. And we're also starting to research other areas like audio, right? And we do 30 billion pieces of human interactions a month, which is quite the insane number, right?
Yeah.
In terms of that vision that I mentioned in the agenda, I find it really important to frame with the why. Mm-hmm. Why are we doing this? What is the point? And when you think about all that awesome benefit that social brings that Liza is talking about, we really believe that we can enable that, right? That awesome benefit, but in order to do so, it's important for people to be able to interact without that fear of abuse and harassment. That's really, really key, and that guides our work here at Two Hat. So for goals, for this next part where we talked about defining, identifying, and actioning offensive chat, I really hope that we can convey a working model for you to set a foundation in terms of your community guidelines, what's important for your game, what you're trying to be very intentional about as you build your gaming community. Also, we want to share this multi-data analysis of player behavior so you can look at multiple data points to make your decisions in your suite of tools and also approaches that you have. And very important also to empower you with some proactive thinking, because we know legislation is coming, right? We'll talk more about this, but there's a lot of legislation that's going to affect online spaces in general, and games are not going to be excluded from it. And also empower you with a lot of resources, like I said. So if you want the presentation, there will be a contact at the end. Just let us know and we'll send you the resources. Very important note, though, that I want to make. This is not meant to be prescriptive, right? I don't want to say, okay, here's the silver bullet, and this is the prescription, and you can go and solve all the problems under the sun when it comes to player behavior. For sure, that's not the case. And also just a note for you that there's some subjects we're going to discuss in one of the slides that are a bit more sensitive, but we need to talk about those things. And despite not having a silver bullet here, we hope to give you some guidance on how you can explore questions and have some actionable takeaways at the end. All right, first things first. And the very name of our webinar is very much a trick, right? Because when you say offensive, well, what do you mean by offensive?
Right, exactly.
Right?
Well, it depends on your community, it depends on your context. Yeah, there's what I might find offensive, you might not, or vice versa.
Exactly, and right there we can see difference between two players, right? Imagine a whole community. So I would like to suggest a different terminology. Here at Two Hat, we're also all about terminology and having alignment on those things in a way that's more productive when we're working as an industry, right? So instead of saying offensive, which can be a vague term, I like to say negative, inappropriate. You can say damaging content, damaging chat. I think we're getting a bit closer when we say that. But still, it bears the question, right? Like, what is negative chat? Because and a little shout out there for everybody who likes Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I certainly do. And there you go, right? Like, that is definitely not a very offensive taunt, right? But perhaps we need to really understand what we're talking about when we are saying negative chat even, or inappropriate chat. When we look at the whole idea of negative chat, we are, like Liza said, well, it depends on so many different things. And you can see on the screen right now, you have different cultural expectation, right? One of the best analogies that I have heard from friends in the industry recently is we all used to sit in the same sofa, maybe with our friends. And in Brazil, I was playing Street Fighter, you know, or Road Rash. I love Road Rash, for example, right? But Street Fighter was that game you played with friends, right? Competition, and it's awesome. But now, when you play a fighting game online, you are like, there are many people in this sofa and changing places, and you don't know. It might be somebody in Brazil, somebody in China, somebody here in Canada, in the US, and
different languages, different culture, different perspectives, different time zones.
Exactly. Maybe Lisa is coming to play Street Fighter, very competitive, and then I'm like,
I'm Canadian. I'm going to come very politely. Got to maintain that Canadianism.
Yeah, and we have that mismatched expectation, right there. I want to be competitive, and if we're on the same team, right there, like, you have that difference in terms of what you are expecting in terms of behavior, right? And of course, the different types of game. We talked about fighting games here. It could be a first-person shooter. It could be a family game. So different audiences, mixed audiences sometimes.
Or even different skill level, because that's often the source of frustration between players. If I'm a newbie coming in and I'm not so good with the controls, and you're a pro and you want to do all the advanced moves, we've got that mismatch.
Absolutely. By the way, huge learning curve for me right now playing Apex. And it's kind of embarrassing, but I'm learning.
But wouldn't you appreciate if your teammates are a little bit more patient with you?
Yes, and that's something that actually people have been reviving me and understanding that I need help, which is awesome.
Versus putting you down and going, dude, why aren't you learning?
Saying something awful in the voice chat, then you would discourage me right away, right? And of course, we have also the context of private chat is different from lobby chat, right? Very different. And if you are in a friends list of somebody, also very different relationship there. We have to consider all those things. So here's the proposed starting point that I have for our conversation. We can look at negative chat, and maybe we can say that's any type of communication in your games that are going to get in the way of the intended social interactions.
Right.
So when we say intended, it's very much about that intention of a purpose as well, right? I like to believe that when we develop games, we have a very clear purpose of an experience that we want to drive, right? And usually it's related to having fun, it's related to connection.
Well, and that's why these social features are created in the first place. As game developers, everyone is optimistic. It comes from a place of optimism. Like, this feature is going to be so great. People are going to talk to each other. They're going to play. They're going to challenge each other, and it's to keep that optimism and keep that positive intention of those social features.
Absolutely. What you said right there, Liz, I think is so important. The same rigor that we put into game development, thinking about the impact in the community and how we design social systems in game. If we could put the same rigor on that, we could probably be way more proactive and avoid friction between players.
Yeah.
Excellent. So we get to our first layer of community protection. We have 5 layers that we really believe in here at Two Hat. And you can see that the very first layer is the center there, the very core of this whole conversation. And why is as simple as what I'm going to say, but then as complex as reaching consensus in your company, as simple as being clear about the norms in your community, right? And the really key part there is to look at your community as it's a very complex situation. So we want to be clear about the negative behavior we want to discourage, but also why not talk about the positive and type of examples of behavior that we want to encourage, that the community is about. So being very clear about those things is the foundation that you're going to need to build all your strategy on content moderation.
Yes, it all starts there.
Absolutely. So, and of course the benefit for you is you set the tone of your community. And you build trust with your players right away. So in terms of being intentional and walking the walk there, you gotta go beyond generic, vague types of community guidelines, right? You have to really call out the types of behavior that you want to, just a second here. You want to call out the types of behavior that you want to discourage, right? But you want to be clear. And you want to say, if you're talking about hate speech, what do you consider hate speech, right? Call it very clearly. Give examples.
And it's know your audience. You know, if you're targeting an audience that is going to be predominantly adults, like setting the tone for that versus an audience that is much younger. So if you have a much younger audience, obviously you're going to have different specific requirements for that community policy.
Absolutely, and the type of language that you use there to that audience, like you're saying, maybe you want to align it with exactly the tone of your game.
Yes.
It's an awesome way to do it. And something I would love to see more in the games industry is people using their social channels to talk about the community guidelines, blogging about it, having in-game events,
Yeah, well, because you're building a community. So yeah, what is it that you want this community to be? How do you want to think of this community and this community to think of itself?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this idea of running a thinking exercise to reach consensus internally in your company as well. In the resources part of this presentation, there are some questions that can get you started so you can have a conversation that's cross-discipline as well, with the community team or with the security team, with the game developers. You can all have a conversation to see what you're trying to create together. You would be surprised, I've talked to all sorts of gaming companies last year, doing consultations for them, large companies, and it's so hard to reach consensus. So not a very easy task, right? You will see that in this slide here, those are hyperlinked, and one is a bit difficult to see there, but I added 2 examples. One example from Twitch. Oh, hey, we're on Twitch right now.
Yeah.
They have done an amazing study with an A and B test. I'm not going to spoil so much, but they basically popped up the guidelines of channels to a group, and other group, they didn't pop up the guidelines. And you can see the difference, what it did to behavior in the channel. And also Reddit has done a really cool study that you can check later.
Yeah.
So now that we talked about that definition, how do we identify it? And then, very important, how do we action it?
What do you do with it? Yeah.
Exactly. When it comes to identifying, I really think we need to move beyond something here. One thing is, of course, language is not about an allow and disallow list. Starts there, right? We can't say that a word or a sentence is always good or always bad. So context is really key. But I would say we need to go beyond looking at language as a proxy for intent, because it can be a really bad proxy for intent. Because of all those different contexts we're talking about and situations, I might say something, but I might be quoting, or I might be saying something to Lisa because I know her. It's really different from saying to somebody I don't know. So the key, in my opinion, is really to consider a holistic look at player behavior, right? We need to understand what is the past behavior of that player. Have they been reported in the past, right? And how many of those reports resulted in action?
Yeah.
You know, it's really important for us to look at their username, perhaps. Maybe their username already indicates that they are engaging in racist type of speech, right?
Yeah.
And then if they are saying something that is like racist or could be perceived as so, you have better data points to deal with. But here's the really key question that I think we need to look at. Is the player being subversive in how they are typing and trying to manipulate the filter to get something across? This is where we talk about unnatural language processing, right? So it's not about just looking at what we call natural language, because natural language would be the examples on the left, right, where there is, proper spelling and grammar and structures.
Which is all fairly easy to catch. But when people are starting to subvert the filter, like you see on the other side of the table, that is a lot more difficult. And it's also where you really get to see your players' creativity, not necessarily in a good way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, internet lingo is, of course, pop culture. It's a very common thing to do all sorts of.
And changes every single, and it changes like that. Like it's every single day, something new is coming up.
Absolutely. How do we stay on top of that? A million Unicodes, right?
Yeah.
You could replace what you're seeing on the screen there. Perhaps the C on Canadians on the right, I could use a Unicode. It looks like the letter C in our alphabet, but really isn't.
Yeah.
And that would break most filters out there, right?
Yeah.
Which is one of the big reasons why it's really difficult to build this in-house, because maintaining this is pretty much a nightmare if it's not your sole focus, right? Like we, for example, do this every day, and processing 30 billion, like we talked about, pieces of content a month, right? And we see everything under the sun. But here's the really key point that I like to make about this area. It's a potential sign of intent.
Yes.
Now it's a better proxy, right? Because, of course, just because I am putting upside down characters doesn't mean I am being negative and disruptive.
No.
But it could be a signal that you can use in your system to say, wait a second, this smells funny.
This person is intentionally trying to go after and subvert the filter. What are they trying to do? It is a signal.
Absolutely. I think it's a really key signal, and something we use quite a lot here, right? We have even like a subversive topic in our filter, and that goes hand in hand with something we call user reputation. Users who are consistently negative, you can see that a lot of times they will try to break the filter, right? So we get to the second layer of community protection now, and really key for us to look now at, okay, how do we classify and actually start taking action, right? We start filtering content, but it's more than just filtering, right? I don't want us to dwell on that idea of hand slapping, right? I think the industry has moved beyond that a long time ago, and we need to continue that push, which is sometimes you need to nudge players in the right direction. You need to warn them.
Yeah, or reward the right behavior. So if you've got members of your community who are advocates, who are positive influences in your community, being able to give them more freedom or some sort of reward, you're supporting them in the right behavior, and then they become a good influence for others. So it's not just about the negative, it's also how do you support the positive.
Awesome. I love the framing with the positive. And lots of companies are using ambassadors nowadays,
Yes.
right? And it goes back to that to the community guidelines. Like you want to model the behavior you want to see. Nowadays, companies can do that with streamers as well, right? Streamers they set examples, especially example for younger players.
Yes.
Right? I think that's so key. We need to think about that. I love that point, Lisa, to reinforce the positive. Filtering classification is not about all about the hand slapping,
No.
right?
No. But gamers don't like hand slapping anyways.
Exactly. So we need to look at more holistic solutions here. And of course, the benefit to you is when you're tackling the negative, you're providing a better user experience by removing what gets in the way of that positive user experience, right? And hopefully, going back to Lisa's slide, we can reduce user churn by doing so. All right, so what are the goals of enforcement then? And I think it's really key for us to talk about that. And again, we're not trying to disable communication, right? We're not trying to over-filter or anything like that in our games. What we're trying to do is to use the right technique at the right time.
Yeah.
If we're talking about extreme hate speech and abuse, we probably want to filter that, right? There is technology to tackle that. We don't even need human eyes on that sort of horrible stuff. If we were even going to talk about images, maybe in avatar images or pictures being shared in our gaming forums, if it's straight up something that can be prevented, like a very violent content and things like that, also, it's our benefit to deal with that for sure. But we want to enable communication.
Yes.
And that's really the key here,
Yes.
right? That's the goal of enforcement, is to remove the bad stuff so we can enable interactions, right? In terms of recommendations when it comes to actioning negative behavior, I really would love to recommend this talk to you, because the key here is it has to happen in real time.
Yes.
Right?
If there's any delay, so in terms of, well, one, if you're dealing with in-game chat, the player, it has to act at the same speed that the player is talking. If it's delayed, if they say something but the action's not taken to several minutes later, they're not going to remember what they said, and they're just going to go, I was just talking about lettuce. Why am all of a sudden am I being banned? Because it's like, are we against vegetables? No, it's because it's probably something that they said 5 minutes ago, but they don't remember that. All they're going to remember is that the game banned them while talking about lettuce, not necessarily about what they did 5 minutes ago. So it has to be as close to real time as when the offensive action occurred.
Absolutely. That's how you have any hope of making that behavioral modification,
Yes.
right? Having that effect. And it's the same thing for warning and
Yes.
muting, and those things it's very helpful for you to be able to do that on the go,
Yeah.
right? And the key reference I put for you there is this talk by Ben at GDC. It's available in the vault, and it's available for free. So again, it's hyperlinked. Ben is wonderful, and he gives a really amazing framework to think about this topic here. All right, we are already on our third layer of community protection. And here is all about user reputation, something that we talk a lot about here at TUHAT, right? And it goes back to what Lisa said as well, which is we want to be identifying when users are being negative, and then you can change the filter settings on the go automatically to those players who are being disruptive. But then on the other end, for anybody who is being super positive, engaging, you can also use that reputation system to reward them, to reinforce that positive behavior.
Yeah, encourage your ambassadors, encourage the positive influences in your community. But at the same time, if somebody's going to be negative, do you want them to continue with the same privileges? Probably not.
Exactly, and this is where the benefit is you don't apply something that's heavy-handed that affects the whole community because a few are misbehaving. Let's put it this way, right?
You want to customize it to in both directions. You want to customize it to either the negative influences and maybe encouraging their politeness if that's what you need to do, and you want to reward those that are a positive influence.
Awesome. And the reason why I say not applying the heavy-handed settings is that that's why I love the user reputation feature that we have here, because it allows you to change the settings for the players who are being disruptive, not for the whole community.
System. Yeah.
Which is really key. So if there is a question now that I'll wait a few seconds here so we can actually really consider this. What is the type of content then that we need to leave up to players to report? And here's why I asked this question. Is a lot of times what I see in the games industry is that we are putting the onus on players to report negative content.
Yes.
Without doing proactive filtering.
Yeah. But don't we want our players to play the game rather than policing each other?
There you go.
Yeah.
That's a really fundamental point, isn't it? I sometimes consult with gaming companies, and what they tell me is that the way that you report something is by creating a ticket perhaps, or taking a screenshot. Imagine the friction that goes into that. I can imagine that not a lot of players would do it.
No, that's a lot of effort. And that's the thing is then you don't actually, because it's that effort, you don't actually have a good sense of necessarily what's going on in your community if you're relying purely on what players are reporting. Because it does take effort. So it's only a small amount of what is going on is getting reported because someone has to make that effort to make the report.
Exactly. What are you missing?
You're going to be missing a lot.
And that's dangerous, right?
Instead, what's the easier thing to do? Create a report, or report multiple people who are causing problems, or just to go, okay, I'm tired of the behavior and leave the game.
Exactly. The user return there comes again, right?
Exactly. If it's more times, unfortunately, it's easier just to leave the game. It's either to shut it down and maybe come back to it, or maybe not.
Exactly. So that brings us to our fourth layer, which is all about having a smart system to deal with user reports. So first is classifying them really well so you can triage them, right? You can get to the critical reports quicker. So answering the previous question, I think what we need to serve up to players to report is the very nuanced gray area, right? Where, of course, we want to involve our players so they can tell us where things cross the line, right? And there's always new behavior too, so we can't expect that systems are going to be perfect moving forward all the time. As new behavior comes up, players can report it.
And it's unfortunate, but there are certain kinds of behavior. I won't get into the details on this, but it is areas that, of course, are our biggest concern for our research. Is there are certain behaviors that are extremely nuanced, where it could be extremely polite, but actually it has even up to criminal intent, and that is where you need your human moderation to really be able to pay attention and understand those nuances.
Absolutely. For those really critical nuanced topics, we don't necessarily want to automate that, right? You need human eyes, and from the players making the report to the moderators reviewing the reports,
yes.
Right? So that's really key. And in terms of the benefits there, if you have a scalable process for reports, first you can remove a lot of the false reports. Because working in the games industry, a lot of us know that a lot of the reports are false and non-actionable, right?
Well, or sometimes players, and this is again, depends on the game's culture or community, sometimes players are using these reports to, a bit of banter or a bit of, kind of a bit of the culture in the game of oh, I'm going to report you, and it's not necessarily a serious report. It is more of just a thing to do. So sometimes that happens as well, and you don't want to bog down your moderators with that. And so having an effective way of dealing and being able to filter this out, or understanding of okay, this stuff is easy to handle, this stuff needs attention. Awesome.
Would you like to just briefly speak into predictive moderation?
Okay. I wasn't prepared for this. So yeah, we have the ability to do predictive moderation, which is to train our system on what your moderators would decide on. So over time, as your moderators are making various calls, our system can learn and then be able to take some of that load off of your moderators. And it's incredibly valuable because, for exactly like what we just described, the things that your moderators see all the time and make the action over and over again, the system will just handle It then frees them up to look at the more subtle stuff, or even spend time with the community, and fostering more of that positive community and that positive interaction that you're looking for.
Awesome, thank you. See, not planned, and you nailed it.
All right.
So in terms of user reporting recommendations, I have some simple recommendations here, and it's really like create a really solid flow in your game that allows players to choose the reason why they're reporting,
Yes.
right? And of course that ties back to the community guidelines, right? Things they should be reporting are things that go against your community guidelines. So that consistency in your process is really important. Also, I love this concept that companies like Tencent Security have done of the reputation of the reporter, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you have reported things in the past and they have resulted in good action, well, you can take that into consideration when you were stack ranking your reports, right? Is that coming from a player who usually make really good reports?
Yeah, who takes this reporting system seriously versus using it as a way of banter.
Exactly, and there is a GGC talk link there as well for you to look more into those recommendations. In terms of the fifth layer, which we just reached the last layer here, we're tracking well for time, and I'm excited because then we have more time for questions, right? It's always good to have that. The fifth layer is where we're really thinking, okay, now that you put those things in place, so what in terms of how do you measure if things are going well, right? Because if you don't measure, how do you know if your system is performing?
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
And I think going well with this layer here as well, something that I didn't previously consider within here, it's not just about that transparency reporting as it pertains to governments, but also to your players and your users, right? I mean, we thought about this before, but perhaps this is a new articulation of it. I think transparency is towards players and, of course, towards the governments who are going to be putting new legislation, but especially to our players, right? We want to show what we are doing in terms of safeguarding. We take it seriously and involve their opinion as possible, right?
Well, again, that goes back to what impression that players are getting before they even play your game. If you've got this sort of transparency reporting and saying, all right, here's what you can expect, here's our community guidelines, here's how we are handling it, it goes into those impressions that players are making as they're discovering your game online.
Absolutely. So the key of this fifth layer is really to look at upcoming legislation that will mandate that companies do this transparency reporting in terms of how many occasions of online harms did they have in the last year or quarter, but per type of online harm. Maybe it's cyberbullying, maybe it's child abuse, maybe we're talking about hate speech. And we know that those laws are coming in the UK. Australia is just closed consultation for the upgraded laws that they're going to make. So we know this is coming. And what can we start doing right now as an industry to be proactive, get ahead of the curve, and actually start measuring and having some stats in our back pocket, right?
Yeah.
I imagine this is definitely something that Liza is always thinking about. Is how do we measure?
Of course, how do you measure it? But it's also, if you know about it, you can improve it. And that's something I've certainly been a big believer in is you can't fix something if you don't know what's going on. And and it's this whole concept of continuous improvement, both of the game and of the player experience.
Awesome. Shouldn't be different when it comes to content moderation.
No, it shouldn't be
right?
different. No.
And I love how this space is maturing,
Yes.
right? And we are all maturing with it. And the games industry, I always defend the games industry a lot when I'm talking to different governments and different people globally, because we have been having multiplayer games before social media was even a thing as we know it.
Yeah.
And we had multiplayer games with all sorts of behavioral challenges.
Yes.
So this is not new to the games industry.
This is not new to the games industry, not at all.
Right?
Yeah.
Even like back in the 90s, there were already MMOs.
Well, yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Well, or at least in the, tiny MMOs if you had a LAN party in your own house. So yes, we were, the games industry has always been leading the way in these things.
Exactly, and I think some games like Ultima and also like Toontown, those games are so old, right? Like they started a long time ago. So there you go, right? All right. So in terms of takeaways for you, I really hope that you got some helpful information in terms of the importance to have alignment and clarity on what you want the intended experience for your players to be in your game, right? What is your game about? What is your community about? What are you trying to encourage? And what are the things that you're going to remove out of the way of this intention you have for the game? In terms of deploying a consistent approach for warning, for muting and filtering content, again, the right technique for the right problem set, right? Like really important. I hope that was also something that was valuable to you. This whole idea of how language can be a bad proxy for intent, and really going beyond that, looking for other data points. Perhaps it's the subversive language, the unnatural language we talked about. Perhaps it's how many times they were reported in the past, their usernames, and so many other, a full holistic view of player behavior in your game. And also deploying the best practices on user reports. And again, not putting the whole onus on your players to make the report. Do the proactive filtering first, because then there are less things to be reported. And guess what? There will be a smaller workload for the team who is responsible for reviewing reports.
Yes, and you'll know what's getting reported is more important.
Yeah. Exactly. You can get to the heart of the matter, because some things you don't have the luxury of time of escalating to law enforcement, for example. You need to get ahead of that, right? Yeah. And now, talking about getting ahead, the idea is for you to get ahead as well of upcoming legislation. And like I said, we have a bunch of resources at the end of this presentation here. And one of them is our recommendations, the 6 tenets white paper that we have for a safer internet. And there's a lot of consideration related to legislation right there. All right, so we reached the point of Q&A, but before I do that, I'm just going to skip ahead and show you what those resources are about. And again, please contact us and we'll send you the PDF version of this presentation. And we will also make the recording available as soon as we can. I have here a few different things about encouraging and reinforcing positive behavior, including a presentation that I gave at the Game UX Summit in 2018, and I was speaking about a lot of cool approaches that gaming companies used to reinforce positive behavior. And there's also a key white paper here that Lisa mentioned in the beginning of our presentation, so you can get the full white paper and see what that was all about. There is a video also from GDC. This is available for free at the Vault. I was also part of this presentation here, but there were multiple companies, including Tencent Security, that I mentioned in this presentation. And it's all about best practices related to user reporting, as well as other areas that could be beneficial to you. I have written this piece for CMX, which is an awesome website that caters to community managers. And I wrote about how do you write community guidelines you can stick to, right? And I have some of the main takeaways here, but you can also access the whole piece. Wellness and resilient resources. I always love sharing this because, the people who do moderation, and I know also that game devs, you end up getting exposed to really negative behavior sometimes on your social accounts, on Twitter and other places. So I think it's a good reminder for all of us to take care of our wellness and resilience when we are dealing with negative behavior, and I have a bunch of resources for you there. And like I mentioned, also compliance considerations that I have for you for that 6 tenets white paper, and the questions for a thought exercise if you're setting your community guidelines, right? So just track back here to our question and answers slide, and you can see the 2 email addresses there where you can contact us. You can send an email to hello@2hat.com, or you can email me directly as well. Happy to chat. If you have any particular challenges that you're facing, happy to have a conversation as well.
Okay, so we have some questions in the channel. And
awesome.
Yeah. Okay, that's too far away from me.
All right, so how often would you recommend that platforms revisit their community guidelines? Oh, I love
That's a
that
good
question. Yeah, that's really good. Which is funny because originally in my presentation, this presentation is a 2.0 evolution of an original presentation I gave last year, and of course with the awesome addition of Lisa here and all her insights. In that original presentation, I talked about this whole idea of revisiting it as often as possible. I would probably recommend as every quarter if you can do a review.
Right. Yeah, that's about right.
Right.
If you can get around to it. But yes, I think just keeping in touch with your community, seeing where they're evolving, and updating your guidelines accordingly.
Exactly. And I'll give you an example here that why that would be needed on that frequency. Pop culture changes all the time.
Absolutely.
Emojis.
Yep.
You know, like we don't even have considerations in a lot of community guidelines about use of emojis, for example.
Or even just the evolution of your audience. Like your audience, you know, when you first release your game, you may be targeting a more mature audience, but then over time, kids start discovering it, and you may even have to add a second policy of going, all right, one policy for the adults, one policy for the not adults. You know, your game audience may evolve over time, so it's worth checking in and seeing whether or not your policy is still relevant for the audience that is currently playing your game.
Exactly, and sometimes that review, the quarterly review, can be as quick as we don't have anything to change.
Yeah, it could be. That's great, but at least you check in on it.
Exactly, you have that discipline, right? Another question here. So are there any concerns about player privacy violations, especially with GDPR and other laws when implementing moderation practices and transparency reports? Wow, that's an awesome question.
That's a big question.
It's a very big question. And what I can tell you is something that our CEO, Chris Preeb, says here, and I really love how he puts it. It's a no surprise policy.
Yes.
So as a company, if we're very clear about we deploy those types of technologies for the sole purpose of identifying and actioning, you know, maybe we can give you some terminology here, not legal advice though, but some terminology of how you can say we deploy those technologies to identify, right, and to action on negative behavior as set in our community guidelines, in our terms of use. So being very specific about that, being very clear about player privacy and rights, and saying, why do you use the data? You use the data to protect players.
Yes, right? And that's it. It's that simple.
Exactly.
Next question.
Are there any additional considerations when making a game for teens like Fortnite?
Yeah, teens are tough. I'm just going to be pretty blunt on this one. Teens are probably the toughest audience because depending on what country you're in, you have a different age group where the line starts between child and not child. So in some countries that age level is 13, other countries that goes up to 16. And so you've got teens as well who are, well, I think they're professional boundary pushers. I think all parents will probably recognize this. It's like all their teens are doing is pushing boundaries and figuring out where those boundaries are and how they can push those. So yes, I would say definitely you need to consider, if you do have teens, consider that they are going to be what teens do. They explore adult topics, and the legal definition of child and adult varies from country to country. So you do need to consider that of like what countries you're publishing to, what the age range is, and then trying to figure out that sweet spot between, okay, these are not small children anymore. They are going to be expressing themselves and pushing those boundaries, but obviously not having the same, maybe not necessarily having the same level of freedom as a game that is completely targeted towards adults and that has an adult audience. It's like what we said at the beginning of this, there's no silver bullet, but I'm going to say if you've got teens, you definitely need to really think about those community guidelines and how you're going to position them.
Agreed. And I would also add that even though we might be targeting a game to teenagers, the reality is that children will also play a lot of those games.
Your game, no matter what audience you're trying to target, there will be a younger audience that follows. So if your game is targeted teenagers, their little brothers and sisters are going to play because their little brothers and sisters want to be like their big brothers and sisters. So it's inevitable. You will always have a younger audience that follows your intended audience. I'm pretty sure Fortnite, when it first came out, was thinking, we're going to have a older teen and mature audience. And then as word spread about it, of course, all the kids then got on board. And so this is where you'd be aware of that. And that's where maybe some games end up developing two policies, one for adults and one for not adults.
I love that because you can take those policies and translate them into the operations of your chat filter as well, right?
Yes.
Like we have seen awesome examples in the games industry. So I think, again, it goes back to those policies. That's the foundation of everything. Then you deploy those techniques to cater to those different audiences, right?
Yeah. Oh, more questions.
Is there any kind of support for moderation of voice chat abuses that your team recommends? So let me make sure I understood. Support for moderation of voice chat. So it would be like a team doing that moderation, or is it like support as in like the technique, the tools to do so? I will go with the latter.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, I would say whoever, the person who asked the question, if they can clarify.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, a tool.
Tool. Okay.
Okay, perfect. So in terms of recommendations, I know that there are different companies working on this right now. I know that, we are, for example, looking at possible solutions. I know that Vivox is one of the companies that has been doing some really cool, Vivox is part of Unity, and they have been exploring this space, which is really awesome. And we have been exploring different techniques for this, haven't we?
Yes, we have. I don't really want to get into that necessarily because that is our research.
That is our research,
so
exactly.
That is research. But in terms of, I believe, I'm just trying to remember which game it was, but was actually using the reporting system as a way. So it was just and kind of like a user reputation system. The name of the game escapes me right now if I think of it. But there was one example of a game doing that. So it'll come to me.
Yes, awesome. And as far as I know as well, this is very much at the cutting edge. Everybody's developing this. So I don't have a specific recommendation of a foolproof system that's out there as much as I have, for example, for text filtering, right? Yeah. I wouldn't be able to 100% say that, but definitely watch those companies. All right, so it seems like a hard question. Preface as a hard question. If a company has limited resources, what would you say is the one change or policy you would recommend to build healthy chat? What's the one, the biggest impact, smallest effort to change that I recommend? That's an awesome question. And here's the thing, you asked for one thing, but I can't help to suggest two. Because those things...
Put them in order then.
Yeah. Sorry?
Put them in order.
In order. Okay,
yeah.
I'm going to stack rank then. The very first thing, I think that if you can do this, I think that would change things in the long term, is what we discussed earlier in the webinar. The same rigor that you put into developing the balancing the game and the features and the way that the game works for your players, think about the social interactions with the same rigor. So at the time of game development and not as something you tack on later.
Yeah, I think that is key, especially if you're developing a social game. It needs to be integrated in your whole game design. And that way it becomes just part of the overall development flow versus that mad rush at the end where oh no, we're going to have chat. And then you try to cram in all the features to try to figure out how to make that work. So the more that you can think about it right from the beginning and integrate it in your overall game design, well, one, the easier it is over the long term. And then when you use a system like ours, it's already set up and designed well to benefit from a system like ours.
Exactly. And, perhaps it's a bit of sometimes for companies, a cultural change. And I know that's not so easy, but maybe it's having people come under the tent, community coming with the game design and artists and everybody having a conversation together, so that key discipline of thinking about player safety and well-being can be put in the way you do design of the game. So that would be my number one. The second one that I would say is really that whole conversation about community guidelines. If you can set crystal clear what you want it to be.
Set clear expectations with your players. It starts there. And even if you are still manually moderating and in having a team of human moderators, without clear community guidelines, you're not even giving them a solid platform on which to do their jobs. So that is, it is the foundation. As Carlos said at the beginning of the webinar, it's the core of everything. So put the time and effort in making sure your community guidelines are clear.
Awesome. What I love about those two things, like Lisa said, you do them and then you're well set up for the future.
Yeah.
When you get more resources, when you can deploy more techniques, you have a solid foundation to build upon, right? One more question. Is there any way to easily split up communities within a game based on desired content levels? Like if you want to be able to support more mature language for some players.
Yes, we can do that.
Absolutely.
Well, you know better. You know better than I do, even. So
I can definitely speak into that. Yeah. So one use case that we have seen, in our client base is sometimes there are games that have under 13 and over 13 folks interacting in the same environment, right, in the same game. So the way you are able to facilitate that is to have filter settings that are very flexible, right? So if you have what we call different policy guides, essentially policy guides is where you draw the line in the sand. So you say up to this level of profanity, we're okay. Over this, we're not okay. Hate speech, we cut the line right here. You can have different settings for the over 13 and for the under 13.
yeah, so that is with respect to game design, that's where you would need to put an age gate in, so you can identify those players that are under 13 versus over 13. Conversely, again, from a game design standpoint, you could actually ask your players what they prefer, and set up your policy based off of that. It's like when they're entering the game, it's like, I would like a civilized and polite discourse, and choose that versus like, yeah, I don't care, let it rip, and you could develop then community guidelines off of those two options. Just that you have some way of your player either based off of age gate or their preference to indicate what it is that they prefer.
Exactly.
But yes, you can set policies based on that. Yeah.
Awesome point. You need to know then who that player is, so you can call the right setting when you're doing your filtering, right? Like Lisa said, and I love the idea of serving the option to the player. I believe Twitch has done or still do this sort of setting where you can very much set the tone of your channel, right? So I love this idea of customization by the player.
Yes. Any other questions?
That
We'll
was the
leave the
last question.
channel open. We still have 2 minutes left.
2 minutes, yeah. If we have one question, one more, then we can.
Oh, there's one more.
Oh yeah. Okay. So Counter-Strike Global Offensive added a recent patch that players that get a lot of voice chat abuse reports are muted to everyone until an individual decides to unmute them for their self.
Okay, so that's that.
Ooh.
Thank you. So the person who put that out there, yes. Okay, that is an example. Actually, wasn't the one I was thinking of. There's another one, but that is exactly the example, the sort of example I was thinking about of how a game has tied the user reporting system into a way of monitoring voice chat.
Awesome. Yeah, that's when you're thinking about signals as well, right? Like we're talking about multi-data analysis of player behavior, right? If you have a player who has like 10 reports in the last 7 days against them and they ended up getting a suspension or something like that, and you have they're being reported for a voice chat, well, you probably have multiple data points now to say, maybe the privilege of audio needs to be reconsidered here temporarily, even just like Counter-Strike did. But when I think about that, it's like that idea of, we were talking about user reputation, right? One of our clients has done something really cool when it comes to images. New users, they place them as a not trusted player user, and then when they're a not trusted user, when they post an image, it goes to a different queue for manual review until they post 5 positive images.
Yeah, to build up that trust, to build up that user reputation.
Exactly. Why couldn't we do something like that with with audio?
Well,
like you have to warn audio. Yeah. Sometimes, of course, audio is essential to gameplay.
Yes.
In that case, we can't just simply do this. But I think we can get creative in terms of understanding the holistic player behavior, right?
Yes. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us on a Friday afternoon.
Yes.
Oh, is there? No? Okay. So thank you for joining us, and enjoy your Friday afternoon, and have a wonderful weekend.
Yes, and I wanted to thank IGDA so much. We love the work that the association does supporting game developers globally, and we really believe that we want to aid with that mission, and we hopefully provided some useful and valuable tools and ideas for you here to accomplish that. And thanks everyone for joining the live streaming.
Bye.
Bye.